It started in a Florida courtroom that had already seen its fair share of media frenzy, but nothing quite like this. The room was heavy with tension, like a gathering storm refusing to break. Every chair was filled, the silence broken only by the rustling of notes, the shifting of weight, the whispered speculation about what Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, known for her fierce advocacy, was about to say. But this wasn't about law as usual. This time, it was about something deeper, something raw, something divine. Pam stood tall behind the oak podium, her blonde hair gathered in a disciplined twist that matched her steel-like composure. She looked directly at the 12 jurors who would decide the fate of a woman on trial for something shockingly simple, yet profoundly controversial, praying aloud on government property after hours. The defendant, Elise Manning, a soft-spoken single mother of 2, had been arrested for kneeling alone in front of a state building, whispering scripture into the night. No signage, no crowd, no slogans, just her, the moonlight, and her Bible. "I'm not here to argue policy," Pam began, her voice low and unwavering. "I'm not here to rewrite constitutional law. I'm here because something sacred is being crushed under the weight of bureaucratic fear." Gasps rippled through the back of the room where press badges glinted under artificial light. Elise, sitting silently beside her public defender, trembled slightly, her eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. She hadn't expected Bondi to come out of political semi-retirement for her case. She hadn't expected to matter this much to anyone. But Pam's eyes found her face for a moment. A silent message passed. "You are not invisible. Not today." The prosecution had leaned heavily into the argument of order, of protocol, of the secular sanctity of government spaces. They painted Elise's actions as a public nuisance, a step too close to endorsing religion with state presence. But Pam didn't argue the technicalities. She went straight for the soul. This woman did not interrupt. She did not protest. She did not incite. She bowed her head, Pam said, stepping forward with a sudden quiet force that made even the judge sit up straighter. "Tell me, what is threatening about a woman speaking to her God in the shadows when no one is there to listen but heaven itself?" She paused for breath, and the silence felt eternal. "You tell me where in the Constitution it says we must strip human beings of their private sanctity the moment they step near a building with government walls. Because if that line exists, I missed it in law school. I missed it in every courtroom I ever entered." A single tear slipped down Elise's cheek. Her fingers clutched the edge of her seat, as if she were trying to hold on to something that might still slip away. Pam turned, her back to the jury for a moment, looking toward the judge's bench, then to the gallery. This case is not about law. It's about fear. Fear of symbols. Fear of what we might appear to endorse. But we forget. We're not endorsing her faith. We're defending her right to have it, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's unpopular, especially then. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man with graying temples and a hardened expression, blinked rapidly, his jaw set in conflict. Another, a young woman in her 20s, had her hand over her heart. Pam's voice broke slightly, but she did not waver. "I remember my mother kneeling beside my bed at night. She wasn't fighting a war. She wasn't trying to change a nation. She was asking for peace, for strength, for her children to be okay. That's what Elise Manning did. She asked for peace. And this country is supposed to be big enough for that." The judge looked down, writing something slowly, thoughtfully. A clerk fidgeted. In the back, the sound of someone stifling a sob could be heard. Pam returned to her table. The closing argument had ended. No further words were needed. The air itself had changed. And then the jury rose. What they would do next, no one could have predicted. The jurors filed into the deliberation room like shadows, moving across a fragile canvas, each step echoing against the marble floors as if destiny itself were announcing their weight. For a long time, the courtroom remained hushed, holding its collective breath. No murmurs, no movement, only the quiet pulse of anticipation vibrating in the walls. Inside the jury room, the tension was molten. The foreman, a stern woman named Carol Wexler, cleared her throat and laid the instructions on the center of the table. The papers seemed heavier than they should have, as if the weight of public expectation had seeped into the fibers. No one spoke at first. They all knew this wasn't just a case about a minor infraction. It was a test of conscience, a reckoning. "Let's be honest," said Juror No. 5, a retired Navy officer named Darrell Langston, folding his arms. "This woman didn't hurt anyone. I've fought wars for the freedom she exercised. You think I'm going to turn around and say she doesn't have the right to bow her damn head? But that's not the law," said Juror No. 3, a thin, bespectacled accountant named Martin. "The law says, well, it implies, that government spaces can't be used for religious demonstration, right? Even if it's small." "No," Carol said sharply, her voice slicing through the hesitance. "The law says the government can't establish religion. This isn't that. This is a woman, alone on a public sidewalk, praying, quietly, not preaching, not recruiting, just praying." She broke a curfew, someone added from the far end. The building was closed. "And yet she didn't enter the building," Darrell shot back. "She didn't break in, she was on public property." "But there are rules for a reason," Martin insisted. "If we let this go, what's next? What's the precedent?" Carol leaned forward. Her voice dropped, but the force behind it only intensified. "What's the precedent if we don't let it go? That Americans can be arrested for praying in silence? That our rights exist only when they don't offend someone else's optics?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that carves cracks into certainty. "I was raised Catholic," whispered Juror No. 9, a soft-spoken kindergarten teacher named Lucia. "My mother used to pray in the garden every morning. She would whisper to God so the flowers could hear. This woman reminded me of her." Silence. Then Carol placed her hand over the verdict form. "Let's take a vote." The papers were passed. Pens scratched across the surface like the quiet scratching of fate writing its own. Lines, 12 ballots, 12 voices. Back in the courtroom, Elise sat with her hands locked in front of her, knuckles white, lips moving in a silent mantra. Pam sat beside her, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the door that separated justice from the world. It didn't creak. It didn't swing open like it had in television dramas. It clicked. Softly. The jury filed back in, expressionless, their hands at their sides like soldiers returning from an invisible war. The bailiff called for order. The judge looked at the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Carol stood, chin held high. "We have, Your Honor." The paper was handed off, and the judge's eyes flickered across it. He looked surprised for just a fraction of a second, his composure cracking just long enough for those watching closely to catch it. "In the matter of the state of Florida versus Elise Manning," the judge read aloud, his voice steadier than his fingers, "on the charge of trespassing and unauthorized religious demonstration on government property, we find the defendant—" Elise closed her eyes. "Not guilty." A sound rippled through the courtroom. Not a cheer, not a cry, something more sacred, a release, as if the very air had exhaled. Elise gasped, her hands flying to her face. Tears poured down her cheeks like cleansing rain, her shoulders trembling under the weight of disbelief. She looked to Pam, who nodded once, not with pride, but with the calm assurance of someone who had simply done what needed to be done. Reporters scrambled. Flashbulbs flared. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman fell to her knees in prayer, not in protest, not in spectacle, but in gratitude. But what happened next would ripple far beyond the courtroom, beyond Elise, beyond even the verdict. Because the jury didn't just walk out. They stood together, as one, and every single member bowed their heads. For a full minute, in silence, 12 Americans united, praying, not to make a point, but because something in that room had touched them deeper than law, deeper than argument, something eternal. Pam Bondi watched, her throat tightening, not because she had won, but because, for the first time in a long time, she felt like the country itself had remembered something beautiful, and the world outside the courtroom had no idea what was about to come. The news of the verdict spread like wildfire. Within minutes, it was on Twitter, Facebook, and every major news outlet. Jury praise after not guilty verdict, read the headlines, some with awe, others with suspicion, and still others with outrage. Videos taken by courtroom attendees began to circulate, capturing that sacred moment. 12 jurors, heads bowed in quiet unity, untouched by flash or noise. No speeches, no signs, just reverence. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some held candles, some held signs, some just stood silently, unsure of what to feel, but drawn there as if by instinct. Elise stepped into the sunlight like someone reborn, her tear-streaked face lifted to the open sky. The wind played gently with her hair, and for a moment, she simply stood there, motionless, her Bible clutched to her chest like a heartbeat. Chatta followed her out, surrounded by a swarm of microphones and reporters begging for a soundbite. But she didn't give them the dramatic quote they wanted. She raised a hand politely, signaling she would speak, but not with a podium, not with political spin. She walked to Elise, stood beside her, and looked out at the sea of waiting eyes. "America just remembered something today," she said, her voice calm but carrying. "That our rights aren't granted by popularity polls or filtered through fear. They are ours by birth. They are ours by breath. And, yes, even when they are quiet and kneeling in the dark." A woman in the crowd clapped, then another. Then the applause rippled outward, slow but steady, like rain on a still lake. Elise broke down again, overwhelmed. Her knees buckled slightly, but Pam caught her elbow just in time, steadying her without a word. Inside the legal world, chaos erupted. Legal analysts debated whether the jury's prayer had crossed a line, whether the verdict could be contested on grounds of religious influence. Talk shows turned it into a culture war, while some politicians called for an investigation. But others, even those who didn't fully align with Bondi, couldn't deny the power of what had taken place. Somewhere in Washington, a senator reviewed the footage and whispered to his aide, "This is going to change something. I don't know what yet, but it's not going away." Back in Florida, Elise tried to return to normal life, but normal no longer existed. She received thousands of messages, some praising her as a hero, others condemning her as a fraud. The mailbox at her small home overflowed with letters. Some included checks. Others included threats. The weight of attention was almost too much. But one letter stopped her cold. It was handwritten, shaky, addressed from a hospice center in Michigan. "Don't have long," it read, "but I saw what you did. I stopped praying 20 years ago when my son died. I thought God left me. But watching you, something cracked open. Last night, I prayed again. Thank you for reminding me that silence can be the loudest thing of all." Elise read it twice, then folded it with trembling hands. She turned to her children, who sat watching cartoons on the floor, and hugged them so tightly they squealed with laughter. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew their mother was different now, stronger somehow, lighter. And still, the world turned. In church basements and public parks, small prayer groups started forming, not with banners or megaphones, but with quiet resilience. People who had been afraid to show their faith in public found a new courage, inspired by a woman who never meant to become a symbol. Pam Bondi returned to her home that evening, drained but peaceful. She sat on her porch, the Florida sunset bleeding, gold and rose across the sky, and finally allowed herself to breathe. She hadn't planned to get involved. In fact, she had tried to ignore the story when it first surfaced, but something had pulled at her. Something primal, a memory of her own prayers whispered in hospital waiting rooms, the feeling of injustice crawling under her skin. And when she had looked at Elise's face on the news, tired, scared, faithful, she knew she had to act. And now that it was done, she knew something had shifted. Not just in the court, or the media, or the state, but in the soul of the country itself. And it was only the beginning. Weeks passed, but the fire did not die. It spread, quiet and persistent, like roots beneath the soil of a restless nation. Elise Manning, once an anonymous woman whispering prayers in the dark, now found herself invited to speak at churches, community halls, even universities. Yet she never raised her voice. She never changed her tone. She simply told the truth, how she had knelt not for defiance, but for peace. How she never expected anyone to notice. But people noticed. Some state officials tried to downplay the case, brushing it off as a localized anomaly, a technical misstep. But it was too late. Bondi's closing argument, the jury's prayer, the not guilty verdict, all of it had struck a deeper vein. Across the country, other cases were suddenly being revisited. Old citations against individuals praying or meditating in public spaces were dropped. City councils began to rethink ordinances that had once been considered untouchable. One morning, Pam Bondi woke to a voicemail from a law professor at Yale. "You may have just altered First Amendment interpretation in real time," he said. "Congratulations, or condolences, depending on what comes next." Pam smiled, half weary, half humbled. She hadn't set out to start a movement, but maybe movements weren't always lit by fury. Maybe sometimes they were lit by stillness. A Supreme Court clerk leaked word that several justices had taken notice. The footage of the jurors praying had reached chambers where politics often drowned principle. One justice reportedly watched it 3 times in a row, then sat back in silence for a long while. No one knew what that meant. Not yet. Elise kept her job, her kids stayed in school, and the bills still came in. She didn't live in a mansion. She didn't sign a book deal. She didn't want to. But she did speak in whispers to God every night, sometimes out loud when the stars were bright enough to make her believe someone above was truly listening. One of her sons, a shy boy with crooked glasses and a soft voice, asked her one night, "Mom, are you famous now?" She knelt beside his bed, smoothing his blanket, then smiled. "No, baby. I'm just someone who kept talking to God when it didn't make sense to." He nodded. "Can I do that too?" "You always could." Pam returned to court a few months later, but not to defend anyone. She was asked to testify before a legislative committee reviewing freedom of expression laws in public spaces. Her name alone drew record attendance. Some came to cheer her. Some came to confront her. When asked if she believed the jury's prayer was appropriate, she looked them all in the eye and said, "I believe what they did wasn't about doctrine. It was about dignity. They saw something sacred, and they responded, like humans do when they're reminded that the soul still matters." Outside the hearing room, protesters clashed with supporters. Banners flew. Chants echoed. But Pam walked out with her head high and her spine straight. Later that night, Elise called her. She said nothing at first, just the sound of breath and the muffled laughter of children in the background. Then finally, a quiet voice. "Thank you. I still don't understand why you helped me." Pam looked out her window, her reflection caught in the glass beside the stars. "Because," she said slowly, "you reminded me that sometimes the law forgets the people it's supposed to protect. And sometimes it takes one voice in the night to wake it up." They hung up without needing to say more. And somewhere, far, from news cameras, from courtrooms, from politics and firestorms, a woman knelt again in prayer. Not in protest, not in fear, just in faith. This time, no one stopped her. And somewhere nearby, unnoticed, another woman watched. She didn't kneel. She didn't even speak. But she bowed her head, and for the first time in years, she believed.